We spent a few days with Pedro and one whole day with his entire family, getting to know them and them getting to know us. And our meetings with them that few days ended in Guadalajara in their family offices there for another business that they own and operate, with us in the room with them and a couple attorneys in Mexico, and drawing up a 2-year agreement between us as an importer and a brand, and them as a supplier and distillery and producer of the tequila.
Podcasting from Boulder, Colorado. This is the Baby Got Backstory podcast, where we dive into the story behind the story of today's most inspiring storytellers, creators, and entrepreneurs. I like big backstories, and I cannot lie. I am your host, Mark Gutman. I'm Mark Gutman, and on today's episode of Baby Got Backstory, how a kid from Philly left the family business for occupational therapy, only to again follow his heart and build his own tequila brand. Da 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 da. Tequila. You guessed it. On today's episode, we are talking tequila. No, I haven't had any tequila as of yet. And specifically, we're talking Suerte Tequila, founded right here in Boulder, Colorado, by Laurence Spiewak and his business partner. And sometimes in business, it takes a little luck. And other times, you just have to get a lot of luck. Fitting for a tequila brand named Suerte, which means luck in Spanish. But it also helps to listen to your heart and let it guide you. And that is exactly what Laurence did. But enough of me. Let's let Laurence tell you in his own words how it all happened. This episode brought to you by Wild Story. Wait, isn't that your company? It is. And without the generous support of Wild Story, this show would not be possible. A brand isn't a logo or a tagline or even your product. A brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, service, or company. It's what people say about you when you're not in the room. Wild Story helps progressive founders and savvy marketers build purpose-driven brands that connect their business goals with the customers they want to serve so that both the business and the customer needs are met. This results in crazy, happy, loyal customers that purchase again and again, and this is great for business. If that sounds like something you and your team might want to learn more about, reach out at www.wildstory.com, and we'd be happy to tell you more. Now back to our show. So Laurence, you currently have a business and a career that I think just about every American male these days dreams of having. You own and operate a tequila company, but when you were a young boy, were you always into tequila? I mean, did you know that someday that you would own a tequila company when you were a young kid?
No, I had absolutely no idea that I would own a tequila brand someday when I was a kid. My first experience with tequila was similar to many other people's, which was when I don't know how old I was in my late teens, and I was in nightclubs in Philadelphia, where I'm from, on a fake ID, doing shots of Cuervo Gold and getting sicker than a dog.
So a long way away from predestined to becoming a founder of a tequila brand. But when you were in Philadelphia, what was that like? What was your childhood like?
So my childhood was wonderful, actually. I grew up in a suburban middle-class neighborhood outside of Philadelphia. My parents were originally from the city of Philadelphia, from a neighborhood within the city. When I was born, we lived in an area of Philadelphia called Northeast Philadelphia, or more specifically, the neighborhood was called Montclair. But we lived in a tiny little row home, and it was me and my 2-year-old sister when I came home from the hospital, and my parents, and lived in that part of the city for 5 years. And then after that, we moved out to what was becoming and being called the Burbs in roughly, I think it was 1974, roughly. My father was doing very well in the business that he was in. My father was in the clothing, the men's retail clothing business, and was doing very well, and had a custom home built in the suburbs in a development where there was house after house after house of a couple thousand square feet with a swimming pool in the backyard and a basketball hoop in the driveway, and life was good.
So your father was an entrepreneur. He must have had a profound effect on or impact on your childhood. What was it like growing up with a father who had his own business?
It was always fun. It was always very interesting to be with my dad and to interact with my dad related to business. He owned, like I said, a men's retail clothing store, and within that store, my uncle was employed, and my grandfather was employed in the back room and doing the tailoring work. And it was a family operation. It was all friends and family working there. It was a lot of friends and family shopping there. And I have very fond memories of being a little kid, 6 years old, 7, 8 years old, going to work with him and running around the store and hiding amongst the clothes and going in the back and playing around with all the sewing equipment and all the machines that my grandfather operated, and hanging out in my dad's office and playing with the adding machine on his desk. I have incredibly fond memories of my father's business when I was younger, and being a part of that and interacting with that sometimes on a daily basis.
Yeah, it sounds like really he embodied the American dream. I mean, when you're talking about moving from the row houses in Philadelphia, my only context for that is Rocky. So that's all I could think about, Sly, running down the street, punching the air with his kind of old fashioned sweatsuit. But it sounds like your father, really embodied the American dream. Was upwardly mobile. Like great role model. You have fond memories. How come you didn't get into the family business?
Well, just to take one step back for 1 second, what you've said about my father is absolutely true. The American dream. My father was actually born in Cuba. His parents had left Europe just before the war and moved to Cuba because my grandmother had family there. And so my father was born in 1939 in Havana, Cuba, and then my grandparents stayed there for a couple of years. But when my father was roughly 2, almost 3 years old, his parents made a decision to move to the U.S., and so he came to the United States that way. So my father was truly an immigrant himself, along with his two parents, and got his start, in business later on after high school and all of that. And so he was truly living and fulfilling the American dream. Why I didn't get into that business is because that business at one point didn't exist any longer. My father got out of the retail clothing business and moved on to, he became a rawhide broker, was the thing he did after that. And then there was some discussion about me getting into the rawhide business with my father and making it more of our own smaller family business. And at the time I was at Penn State University in central Pennsylvania, and I was trying to make some decisions what I wanted to do or didn't want to do for my future. And at the time just decided that I didn't want to be in the rawhide business. And so my father and I didn't end up working together.
Every time you say the word rawhide business, I can't even conceptualize what the rawhide business is. What is that? Like, what's a rawhide broker?
So a rawhide broker is somebody who buys animal skin from slaughterhouses in North America, so the US, Canada, and Mexico, and then brokers them to companies in Asia that takes that raw hide and turns it into leather through the tanning process. And so my father was a rawhide broker for many years after being in the retail clothing business. And his job was essentially to broker deals between North America and the US, and Asia to the people running the tanneries over there.
Was that a good business?
Yeah, it was a very good business. My father did well in that business as well. It can be very lucrative. There's large transactions. You're talking about container loads of animal skin being bought and sold all the time. And so, yeah, it was a lucrative business for sure.
How did he even get into that business?
The way that he ended up in that business was that, having been in the retail clothing business, he had met a gentleman who had his own brokerage for rawhide. And that gentleman was a customer of his at the men's clothing store. And when the men's clothing store closed down, my father was looking, trying to decide what his next steps were. And he contacted that gentleman to talk to him about the rawhide business and to see what that industry was like, and made a decision to go work with him and for him for the company and the brokerage that he owned and ran.
Oh, so always entrepreneurial, always looking for ways to support the family. I love that. And so he's doing the rawhide business, and it sounds even like a little bit before that, if I got the timeline correctly, somewhere between retail and rawhide. You're going to high school. You're starting to, become your own person and develop your own worldview. What's Laurence like in high school? Like, what are you thinking about? What are you thinking you might do with your life at that point?
In high school, I was definitely thinking about where I was going to go to college, what I wanted to study. I was thinking a lot about sports at that time in my life. I played high school football. I was thinking a lot about girls at that point in my life, and just all the fun stuff that teenagers are up to. But essentially, I'll be honest in saying I didn't necessarily have the entrepreneurial spirit in high school or at that time in my life. It came later for me. But high school was really more just about getting high school done, playing sports, and then moving on and going on to college to figure out what it was more specifically that I wanted to study to take out into the world.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you moved on to Penn State, and is that what you said? Did I get that right? Yeah, Penn State. And what were you studying there?
So at Penn State, I had a dual major, a dual degree. I was basically studying international business, which was obviously a decision that I made because there was conversations going on at the time to possibly work with my father in the business that he was in that rawhide brokerage business. But I was also very passionate about art, and most specifically, I was very passionate about ceramics. I was very lucky in high school. I went to a high school, was one of the very few high schools I've ever heard of, actually, that had a pottery studio and a pottery department as a high school art coursework. And so I had a wonderful teacher in high school who taught me and lots of my friends how to do ceramics. And it was something that I really enjoyed, that really resonated with me, that stuck with me. And so when I was in college, I didn't want to give that up. Penn State, I think they still do, but at the time for sure, they had one of the leading ceramics programs in the country. And so I saw it as an amazing opportunity to study under amazing professors and teachers that were at Penn State University for ceramics. But at the same time, I wanted the business degree and the business education. And so what I did was I went to the dean of the college and proposed that I study both business and art, with the idea that someday I might combine the two in some way to do import-export of artifacts or art from around the world, things like that. And so that's really where my interests and my passions were at the time.
Well, and I'm assuming that the dean went ahead and approved that major?
Yes.
Yeah. And so when you think back at that time and you think back at the ceramic pieces you made, do you have one in mind that just sort of embodies your time there at Penn State?
Yeah, I mean, there's several from Penn State, but the pieces that really stand out in my mind the most are several pieces that still exist either in my house or my parents' house, that came out of the raku process and the raku firing process. Raku turned out to become my favorite ceramics process and way of dealing with and finishing pottery. And the reason for that is with raku, what you do is you put a piece of pottery that you've made into a small kiln, and you heat it up to a certain temperature. And then when it reaches a certain temperature, you put on big asbestos gloves, and you have these big metal holder or grabbers that kind of grab it, and you pull the door open at I want to say it's 12 or 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's this pot in there that's red and glowing, and you actually get to grab it with these tongs and pull it out and put it into whatever material you're going to put it into to finish it. So oftentimes it can be newspaper, it can be wood chips, it can be wood shavings. There's a lot of different materials that you can use, but they all have a different effect and input into the finished product of the pot that you're making. And that to me just was mind blowing, that I could heat something so hot and then open a door and actually interact with it at that temperature.
Oh, that was a great visual. Thank you. I can see that pot glowing. But do you have a favorite pot there or piece that you can tell us about from that process? I'd love to hear about it.
I honestly don't. I mean, I have one piece in my house that's actually my favorite from that process, but it was made not by me, but by a professor at Penn State that I really admired. and he gave me this piece of pottery during my time there. And it's one of the few pieces that I've actually kept around over the years. It's a jar shaped vessel. So the bottom is a little more narrow than the top. So it tapers up and gets wider as it goes up. And then it closes off at the top and becomes a very small, maybe an inch and a half diameter opening at the top with a beautiful lip. And so it's this beautiful jar that looks like it could have been made, thousands of years ago. But it wasn't. It was made more recently. And so that's really my favorite piece that I keep around personally.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So you're in college, you're embarking on a art and international business major. And what's going on for you at that time? Or what are you seeing, or what are you thinking you might do post-college?
So in college, one of the things that was going on for me that I was really getting into that really, I think, helped to start shaping my mind and my intellect around entrepreneurship was I was getting very heavily involved in college with environmental groups. And so I just got to this point in my life where I was reading the news a lot and tuning into what was going on around the world. And I was actually just telling this story very recently to my wife. There was a time when I was in college where one of the largest environmental issues that were going on at the time was the challenges that we were facing around the globe with tuna fishing and with dolphins ending up, being killed through the process of big commercial boats fishing for tuna. And the environmental group that I was part of at Penn State University at that time on campus, actually, we did a lot of work at that time on getting the rules passed that would later go into effect to force tuna companies to either label their tuna as dolphin safe or not. And so that was really a very interesting time for me, when back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of activism going on around the war and around different things, in the world. And during the mid to late 80s and early 90s, when I was in college, the big thing around the country that there were a lot of groups of people my age getting involved with and interacting with and becoming very active about was more environmental issues and how to protect the environment and how to protect the species around the environment. And so I got very heavily involved with that and started to learn during that time of my life that I could have a very significant impact on things in the world if I took the time and set my mind to it and actually got active and got vocal about it.
And why the environment? Why'd you choose that? There's so many different things that you could have put your energy into. What resonated, or how'd you get into becoming an environmental activist?
I think it's just I've always had a love for nature. The house that I grew up in, the suburban house that I grew up in, fortunately for me, was across the street from a big open field that never, for one reason or another, it was owned by the city and it never got developed. And so my friends and I were always in that field or in the forest adjacent to that field. And so I basically grew up running around through the forest, playing with frogs and tadpoles and crayfish and snakes and anything we could find out there. And so I always seem to have a regard and a passion for being outside. I love to hike. I've always loved to camp and do those things. And so in college, it's just what resonated with me was protection of the environment.
Yeah. And so you're having a little bit of this awakening, your worldview's being shaped. You're kind of deciding who you want to be. Do you leave college right away and go pursue a career in activism, or what'd you do?
No, I think much to my parents' dismay, the first thing I did after college, more or less, was I actually came out here to Colorado for the first time. That was 1991. I had a friend from college who had moved after college to Boulder. I had spoken to him and had heard from him about how amazing the environment was here for all the things I love to do, like camping and hiking and mountain biking and all of those things. And so I actually came to Boulder for the first time during that period for a year. And I was kind of, I don't know if I wasn't by definition a ski bum, but I was kind of what I call ski bumming. I was working in a rental shop in Boulder, Colorado, renting skis, working a lot of hours renting skis. And then it was when I learned to snowboard. And so through working at the shop, I had a pass for Eldora Mountain above Boulder. And so I would go and snowboard at Eldora on my days off and use the shop pass to do that. And I just spent time living and working here in Boulder for a year, getting exposed to the mountains and to what I consider to be the wilderness. Pennsylvania has beautiful mountains, but it's very different. It's not quite, at least Eastern Pennsylvania is not quite as wild as places like Colorado. Western PA definitely has much more wilderness and wild places. But at the time, growing up in the suburbs of Pennsylvania, I wasn't being exposed to that. And so I came here after college as the first thing I did. And then from there, I ended up moving back east to be with my family and to stay with my parents again, to work and save money, because my dream and my passion at that time was that I wanted to go and travel overseas and go travel in Europe and backpack and travel by train and have a really fun experience in Europe and other parts of the world.
What is it about travel that captivates you or draws you? I mean, why set that as your vision and your focus?
I was just always learning about all kinds of foreign places around the world. I had never been out of the US. Well, I'd been to Canada as a kid playing ice hockey, but other than Canada, I had never been anywhere out of the United States. And so I just had this curiosity to go and explore and to see what the world was like. And after college and after living in Colorado for a year, I just felt like more exploration of the world is really what I wanted to do and what interested me the most. I wanted to learn about foreign cultures. I wanted to go climb around on mountains in other countries. I wanted to, go to the ocean in other places and put my feet in and see what it was like there. And so I was just curious. I wanted to adventure is really what I wanted.
Yeah, and so that call to adventure, the other side of the world calling you to come travel. Did you go? Did you make it?
Yeah, I did. I stayed. I forget exactly how long it was, but I stayed with my parents for a certain length of time. It might have been as much as a year, even. Just working, living in their house, and just working and saving as much money as I could. And then I set off on a trip overseas. And what I did, I had an interest in kind of diving in deeper to a culture somewhere. And so while I was in college, I had been exposed to this whole concept and philosophy around the Rudolf Steiner movement, or Waldorf education and anthroposophy. And I had learned that there were these communities all over the world. At the time, there were 80 different communities around the world that were considered or called Camp Hill communities. And they were what are called Steiner communities or anthroposophical communities. And their purpose was to care for developmentally disabled children, adolescents, and adults, depending where you go. And so I became very intrigued around that process. And also I became intrigued at that time around intentional community, around people choosing to live together in communities together with a common goal to achieve a certain outcome. And so I decided, rather than put on my backpack and get on the plane and go overseas and just backpack around and, visit different countries on the train and have that wonderful experience, I decided that the way to start would be to go someplace and put my roots in for a little bit, 6 months or so, learn a different culture, learn a different place, and learn more about living in community with other people. And so the first thing I did was I ended up going to an intentional community in Wales, in the United Kingdom, in the southwest part of Wales, and living there for 6 months, helping to care for developmentally disabled adolescents as kind of my launching point for my adventure around the world, or around Europe and other countries that I had been planning to go to.
So what'd your parents think about all this?
My parents thought I was crazy. They didn't like it. They didn't love the idea, but they were supportive. Initially, as with most experiences I had with my parents when I wanted to do something that they weren't that much agreement with, initially it was more questions of, why would you do that? You just got a college degree. Shouldn't you be getting a job? All very valid questions. But my response was always, no, I want to just use the money I've saved and go travel and explore the world and learn about what else is out there. My grandfather, who was still living at the time, who was an adventurer and traveler in his own right, thought I was more crazy than my parents thought, and literally told me that if I was going to go travel around the world, I was going to come back and just be a bum, was the way he phrased it. So everybody was a little confused as to what Laurence was up to at that time.
Yeah, and I got to imagine your father felt like he just, worked really, really hard as an immigrant from Cuba and had, provided this, what he believed, I'm sure, was the best possible life for his kids, sent you to college, and then you go off to Europe. I mean, was there any conflict there between you and your parents?
No, there wasn't conflict. There was some disagreement initially, but like I said, they when they saw and understood that I was determined and that I was willing to work hard and save money and plan the whole thing out and make a trip out of it, they ended up being very supportive of it and very, very helpful, actually.
Oh, it's great to hear. And you spent the beginning of that trip helping developmentally disabled children, saved up your money, and you go on this trip. What did that trip mean to you? Did that have an impact on where you were going to end up next?
So the first 6 months that I spent working with developmentally disabled adolescents had an immense, significant impact. It changed my entire life, actually. That's the experience that I had at that time that led me to my first real true career further down the road. And after being in Wales for 6 months, I spent the next 7 or 8 months traveling all over. The first portion of my trip was all over Western Europe. And then I made my way from Western Europe kind of down south into Turkey, and then used Turkey as kind of a point to launch over, starting heading east, and got a boat actually over through Cyprus and into the Middle East, because I had family in the Middle East. I still do. And so I actually ended up in Israel as part of that trip and got to experience Israel and that whole part of the world for the first time in my life, which was mind blowing. And then, after spending, I think, a month and a half in the Middle East, I came back from the Middle East through Europe and went all through Eastern Europe, which kind of led me along a path north through all the Eastern European countries, including Poland, which is where my grandparents had left when they went to Cuba. And so I made a point of going to the place and the town where my grandparents came from, and going to see what that was like and experiencing that for myself. And then I ended up back in Western Europe. That summer, I ended up going north into Scandinavia. And I traveled by train all through Scandinavia with a backpack and a tent. And I would just literally go train station to train station. And I would ride the train during the day, go to a different town, get off the train, go out and hike and enjoy. And then I would camp in the forest by the train station for the night. And then in the morning, I'd wake up, wait for the next train in the morning to come, and I'd pack everything up, eat some breakfast, and get on the train and go someplace else. So that summer in Scandinavia was fascinating. Being up above the Arctic Circle for part of that, to see the midnight sun, where the sun never drops below the horizon during the night, and just wonderful experiences like that. And then basically ended up, finishing my trip in Scandinavia, going back to London, I believe it was, and flying back to the US from there. And so my travels and my adventures, my time in Wales, and then my travels beyond that shaped my future greatly, without a question.
And so you're on the tail end of an adventure of a lifetime, but you're still very young and you're still just getting started. What do you do once you come back to the US?
So when I came back to the US, what I did was I was determined. I just was convinced that what I needed to do was to continue working with people like the people that I worked with when I was living in Wales. And so I wanted to continue what I learned through the experience in Wales was that I really wanted to do something with my time and to have a profession that would allow me to help other people. That was the big takeaway from living and working in Wales, was that I was taking care of people there. I was helping people to have better lives there. And I wanted to continue to do that. I really liked it. I was really good at it. And I felt like there was a huge need in the world for people who were willing and had the patience to actually care for others. And so I immediately dove very deeply into a research process around figuring out what I was doing in Wales and how to translate that to a profession that I could do in the US. And initially I came up with art therapy because of my interest in art and my passion for things like ceramics. But through doing some interviews with art therapists, I realized that at the time, art therapy wasn't being used in a functional way that I had been doing with the people I was caring for in Wales. And someone suggested that I look into a profession called occupational therapy. And so I did some research on occupational therapy and figured out that it was almost exactly what I had been doing in Wales, working with developmentally disabled populations. And so I set out on a course to study and get a degree, a graduate degree, actually at the time is what I wanted to do, was to get a graduate degree in occupational therapy. And so I set out on that process, which was a long process because my original college education and my original bachelor's degree didn't focus on sciences at all. And in order to become an occupational therapist, there was a certain scientific component to the coursework, especially in a graduate level program. And so I actually had to spend a year living with my folks again and going to community college outside of Philadelphia, taking all the science classes that I never took in college the first time around.
And then where did you go on to study occupational therapy?
So I ended up applying and getting accepted into a program in Oakland, California. There still is a small allied health college there called Samuel Merritt College. And at the time, it was a nursing college for many, many years. And then they expanded several years before I got there. They had expanded into physical therapy. And then they decided to add an occupational therapy program the year that I actually started. So I was in the charter class of the Samuel Merritt College Occupational Therapy graduate program. And so I moved to Northern California and went to grad school in Oakland.
And so after grad school, you go through and get a degree in occupational therapy, I'm going to guess at this point. And you go out and charge and say, all right, I'm an occupational therapist, and start employing that as a profession?
I did. Yep. So I took the graduate program, was a 2.5-year program. The first 2 years, obviously, being all the coursework, everything from a year-long gross anatomy class and dissecting a human cadaver for a year, learning about the human body, to neurology coursework, to development coursework, to all kinds of different health-related and occupational therapy-related coursework. When I finished with that degree, I had decided to go and we were required to do 2 different internships before we could officially get the degree. And those 2 internships were, one was that I wanted to go and do an internship and sent down in Central Valley in California at a hospital, learning what it was like to work with people who had been through traumatic injury. So a lot of spinal cord injury, things like that. And the other thing that I did was I had an internship up in Yakima, Washington during a couple-month period over the summer, doing an internship in a long-term care facility. So essentially what you and I know as a nursing home. And through those experiences, those experiences were set up to help us figure out, as a graduate student and as a graduate of the program, where we wanted to go and work and get involved, because there was a lot of different aspects of occupational therapy. You could work in pediatrics, you could work with older kids, you could work with spinal cord injury and general hospital care, and then you could also work with the elderly. And working with the elderly is actually what I love the most. My grandparents were always the center of the family. And so I've always grown up having a very high regard for elderly people and a lot of respect for elderly people in the first place. And so I decided that long-term care is where I wanted to look for a job and look for employment out of graduate school. And so that's what I did. I moved back from California. I was living in the very lower part of upstate New York, just above New York City. And I got a job working in nursing homes, actually running rehab departments in nursing homes and helping as an occupational therapist in nursing homes.
So how did you get back to Colorado and start a tequila brand?
Very good question, Mark. This is where I usually get most people with their head kind of tilted sideways, looking at me like I have 4 heads. Essentially what happened was I was living on the East Coast working as an occupational therapist and, doing well and making a new career for myself. And a couple of years into that, I decided that I didn't want to be on the East Coast any longer. And so I tried to figure out where it was that I wanted to be. And Boulder, having lived here once in the past, really stuck with me. And it really stood out as a place that I would love to always come back to. And so I made a decision to move off of the East Coast and come west and come back to Colorado to be close to the mountains. I mean, that's really what I wanted. That's what brought me back here, was proximity to the wilderness. I wanted to be close to wild places. I wanted to be able to drive a very short distance, or if not walk from my house and hike. I wanted to be close to the ski resorts or to backcountry snowshoeing and skiing. I wanted to be in the wilderness as much as possible. And so I decided Colorado would be a great place to come back to. Interestingly enough, when I first came back, I couldn't find a job as an occupational therapist. And so the first thing I did when I came back, and this is 20 years ago now, so I arrived back here in 1999. In the fall of 99, I arrived back here, and I was having trouble from a distance finding a job as an occupational therapist. And so what I did was I called the gentleman who was my manager at the ski shop back in 1991, and spoke to him, and he was still there. And it turned out that he had actually bought the ski shop from the original owner and was now the owner. And I told him I wanted to come back to Boulder, but I wasn't going to come if I didn't have a job, because I knew that Boulder wasn't the cheapest place, in the world to live, and that I'd need some sort of income. Didn't have a lot of money saved in the bank. And so wondering if he needed help or if he knew anybody who needed help. And he said, well, it's amazing that you're calling right now, because I actually just figured out I need a manager, someone to actually manage the shop this season for me. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, absolutely. And so as soon as that call ended, I started packing my truck and making plans to drive out and come back to Colorado.
What shop was that?
It's called Crystal Ski Shop in Boulder. And Tony Martinez was the owner. He's no longer the owner. He ended up selling it to an employee of his, I don't know how many years ago now, maybe within the last 10 years. But yeah, it was an amazing way to come back to Boulder and to Colorado specifically.
And so you're working at the ski shop, you're getting a foothold back in Colorado, back to where you love. And what gets you into tequila?
Well, what gets me into tequila, to jump, I guess, to continue moving forward, what gets me into tequila is just my passion for tequila and a passion for Mexico. That's what really gets me into tequila. But what leads up to tequila is a bit of a winding route. I know we don't have that much time. And so I essentially I did find a job working in nursing homes in Colorado, and I did that for 4 years. So I ended up having a total of 10 years as an occupational therapist or rehab director. But then I got burnt out on nursing home work and watching a lot of people die around me. And so I decided to make a change. I had a friend at the time in Boulder who had started a natural organic skincare company. And so I went to him and told him that I was leaving my job and making a career change, and that I would love to work for him and help him to grow this new entrepreneurial endeavor that he had started 3 years previous. And he agreed to do that. And so I started working as initially as a soap maker, but then as the director of operations, and then further as the general manager at a company called Pangea Organics that was based here in Boulder. So I got into consumer packaged goods through that experience. And my interest in entrepreneurship started really developing even more strongly at that point, because I was working for and helping to run an entrepreneurial endeavor and being exposed to entrepreneurship on a daily basis. And so I got into the skincare and consumer packaged goods world at that time. And then that business, I was there for 5 years. I moved on to helping to run another very small skincare company that never really made it very far at that time. And then after that, I got into consulting. My passion was entrepreneurship and helping other entrepreneurs to do business modeling and business planning, and to work more on financial planning and pro formas as a roadmap for growing and building businesses. And it was during my time at Pangea Organics that I had met my co-founder with the tequila brand. He was originally from Mexico, and so we were hanging out a lot at nighttime and on the weekend, drinking tequila together. And I was learning from him a lot about Mexico and about Mexican culture, and also about tequila culture. And we were geeking out on tequila and buying every bottle under the sun that we could find that was different, so we could try every tequila that was out there. And we were literally at a liquor store in Boulder one night. This was probably 12 years ago now, standing in front of a shelf.
What store?
So we were at Liquor Mart.
Very famous Boulder institution for those of you that don't know.
Yeah, and God bless Liquor Mart. They're not there now. They closed up literally just a few months ago, right after the beginning of the year. I had never heard the real true story, full or not true, but the full story. But what I had heard was that the building was sold, or the building was owned by someone else, or something to that regard, and they decided to close down Liquor Mart because that property is going to be now developed into something different. But we were at Liquor Mart one night, and we were standing in front of a shelf of 100, at least 100 different tequila brands. And we were finally getting kind of tired of all the different brands that we had already tried. And we were tired of spending a lot of money on really good tequila. And so we looked at each other and we said, man, wouldn't it be so much fun to start a tequila brand someday? Like, we're in the consumer packaged goods world already. We know how to set up products. We know how to source raw materials. We know how to create packaging. We know how to price things. We know how to get a product out into the market on the shelf. Wouldn't it be so fun to do it with tequila? And so we went home and decided and agreed that we would start doing some business planning. And so for 6 years, on and off, we did a lot of business planning. And every time we would sit down to do business planning and taking it a step further, we would always come to the realization that it was going to take millions of dollars to actually execute and succeed with a tequila brand. And so whenever we'd get to that realization, we'd look at each other and say, man, we got families to raise, we got bills to pay. We better just keep working and doing what we're doing in order to pay our bills and to live and be happy. And so we kept taking that forward and forward. And after 6 years, my co-founder, Lance, Sokol is his name, he was on a trip in Mexico because he was then the director of operations at Madhava Honey and Agave Nectar that's based here in Colorado. And he met a master distiller in Mexico who was looking for someone in the US to fill bottles for, and brought a bottle of Blanco tequila home to me and put it on my kitchen table. And it had no label on it. And so I looked at it and said, well, what's this? And he said, well, we've been talking about starting a tequila brand for 6 years. And I was in Mexico on my last trip, and I met a guy who has a distillery in Mexico who makes tequila. And he's actually looking for someone in the US to produce tequila for. I want you to taste this. And so I tasted it, and he and I agreed that it was one of the better Blancos that we had ever tasted. And so I said, well, what does this mean? And he said, well, I think what it means is that if we get in touch with this guy and tell him that we want to start our own tequila brand, that he might work with us and for us and help us do that. And so we agreed on a handshake that day that we would pursue a dream that we shared together of creating and building and growing a tequila brand.
And so was it that easy? You just went back down and said, all right, we're in. We want to start a tequila brand, start shipping.
It was almost that easy. It was almost. I wouldn't say it was simple, but it wasn't difficult. So we contacted Pedro Hernandez Barba is the name of our master distiller. He's now a business partner of ours, and he owns percentage ownership both of the distillery in Mexico and of the brand Suerte. And we emailed him, and we told him who we were, and we told him that we had an interest ourselves in creating a brand, and asked if he would work with us. He told us that he'd be happy to work with us if we had money to pay for tequila, and that if we were serious and interested, that we should come down to Jalisco and visit with him and his family and talk to them and get an agreement set up between us that we could use to work together and have a partnership. And so literally within a week, we got on a flight. We went to Mexico. We spent a few days with Pedro and one whole day with his entire family, getting to know them and them getting to know us. And our meetings with them that few days ended in Guadalajara in their family offices there for another business that they own and operate, with us in the room with them and a couple of attorneys in Mexico, and drawing up a 2-year agreement between us as an importer and a brand, and them as a supplier and distillery and producer of the tequila. It wasn't very difficult.
And were you surprised? I mean, I'd be thinking, this is crazy. Like, how is this happening?
Yes. I mean, I definitely felt, there was that feeling initially of feeling like, wow, I'm kind of living in a dream. I'm like, I'm going to wake up one day and this isn't going to be true. But it was incredibly exciting. It was, I was in the moment, and I was living as much in the moment at that time as I possibly could. And it was all incredibly fascinating. It was exciting. It was hard to believe that it was happening. But Lance and myself It was one of the best traits that we both brought to the business and to the creation of the business, which was that we had no fear and we had no hesitation. We knew it was what we wanted to do. We knew it was what we felt we had to do. And we were determined and committed 100% to actually making it happen.
Yeah. And so you're at a stage where, in my opinion, there's nothing more exciting, and that is launching and starting a new brand, birthing a brand, so to speak. What was that experience like for you? Where did the name come from? Did you find it to be easy? Did everything just fall in line? Were you struggling with certain aspects of the brand?
No, I mean, we found it to be very easy. I think what we also had going for us at the time is that Lance and I each had our own individual skills and qualities and knowledge of, and we both brought what we had and what we knew to the table. And we both had such amazing experiences in the jobs that we had held up until this point, and the experiences that we had, that there really wasn't too much that was challenging for us. We had a lot of bandwidth. We had a lot of know-how. We had a lot of, we were real scrappy. We had the ability to figure things out very quickly. Of course, thanks to things like Google and the internet and other, people that I knew or that we knew that we were reaching out to, asking questions. But we were very resourceful, and we actually had very little trouble getting set up and getting going. The entire process of getting the business established and getting product into the market was 8 months. And 4 of those months were actually spent literally waiting for our labels, for our bottles to be approved by the TTB, which is a U.S. federal agency that approves all alcoholic beverage labels. And had we known how to do that part better, so I guess, in honesty, that might have been the one place that we had some challenges. We were able to get it done in the end because we found a good attorney. We found the right attorney who knew what he was doing and was able to get it done very quickly. But we spent four months kind of going in circles a little bit, trying to figure it out. And then we figured it out, but we were still having trouble getting the applications submitted and getting them approved. So that was a little challenging, but it wasn't anything that we couldn't overcome. And so within 8 months, we had started up and we had product in a warehouse in Denver at a distributor who had agreed to sell our product in the Colorado market for us.
Yeah. And so where did the name Suerte come from?
So where Suerte came from was Lance and myself. We came up with a list of names. I think initially we might have had 30 to 40 different names, most of them being Spanish words. I came up with a bunch of words and names, and he came up with a bunch of words and names, and we compiled them all into one list. And then we'd get together during the day and we'd go down the list and just use the process of elimination. And he would say the ones that he liked the best, and then I'd say the ones I liked the best, and then we'd eliminate any that we didn't like. And we kept going through that process of elimination until we came down to 5 names that were on the list. And one of those 5 names was Suerte. Suerte means luck. So it's a great word, especially for a tequila brand. It's a word that people are generally familiar with. And so when we saw that on the list of 5, we looked at each other and we said, well, there's no question in our minds that Suerte is the best name on that list. But there is absolutely no way that name is going to be available for a tequila brand. There's no way possible. But let's look into it. And if for any reason or somehow, by great luck, it's available, then it's obviously the name and the word that we have to use. And so we actually went into that process. We spent the money. It wasn't a lot of money, but we spent the money to hire Thomson Reuters and do the whole background search on the name to look through everything and get the most extensive research we could find. And they came back to us, and there was absolutely nothing in the way of using the name Suerte Tequila for a tequila brand.
Oh, that must have been an amazing feeling that day, because I know, and I'm just going through this with some clients right now, how difficult it can be to clear names.
Oh, it's crazy. It was unbelievable. And then the other thing that was really, truly unbelievable, that was the only things that popped up in the search was that there were 2 URLs out there that existed. They were owned by separate people. One person owned suertetequila.com, and another person owned tequilasuerte.com, which in Mexico, and in the Spanish language, you call a tequila brand by Tequila Suerte instead of Suerte Tequila. So we knew that those were owned by other people, but we realized and decided that it wouldn't stop us from doing what we wanted to do. And so we moved forward. And the first one what I did was I went on GoDaddy and I put in a backup offer for both of them. TequilaSuerte.com became available within weeks after deciding to move forward with the name Suerte somehow. And so I got that very inexpensively, very easily. Then the other one, which was SuerteTequila.com, which was more important for us, obviously, I had a backup offer in. And within 6 months, that URL had expired and the person let it go. And it fell into our hands at that point.
It truly is luck. You have a lot of luck around the brand and around the name. Do you remember the first bottle of tequila that you actually sold?
I remember the first bottle of tequila that I sold on premise. So in a restaurant, we sold some añejo bottles to the kitchen in Boulder. Jeff Barrett at the time was the name of. I'm still friends with Jeff. Jeff was the bar manager, I believe, or at least running the bar program at the time for the kitchen in Boulder. And I had met him and someone introduced me to him. And so I went in to let him taste our tequilas and he thought they were phenomenal. And he was a really incredible bartender. And so he started playing around with the añejo and ended up coming up with a recipe to make a tequila Manhattan with our añejo. And so he was, the kitchen in Boulder was one of the first accounts in Boulder to buy our tequila.
And how'd that feel that day when you actually sold a bottle, not gave one away?
Yeah, no, it felt incredible. It was so exciting. I mean, the whole, like you said, I'm with you. One of the most incredible parts of being an entrepreneur or starting new businesses is just that is getting them started. The beginning stages, the first days, weeks, and months, the first year in general is such an exciting time every day. I mean, you jump out of bed, can't wait to get to your computer or get out there working, getting things done because it's all happening so fast. And it's just the adrenaline from that is unbelievable.
Yeah. And so it sounds like it's been a great story thus far. Like, what's hard about running a tequila brand? Like, what don't we know, or what aren't we seeing?
So there's 3 different levels. So the US has what's called a 3-tier system for alcoholic beverage. You have the suppliers. You can be a supplier in the alcoholic beverage industry. You can be a wholesaler in the alcoholic beverage industry, so a distributor essentially, or you can be a retailer. So you're either a shop owner or a restaurant or bar owner, essentially. So those are the 3 tiers, and you can't do business on more than any one of those at a time. So as a supplier, I can't own a distribution business, or I can't own a store or a restaurant. And then vice versa, likewise for them. So a store or a restaurant owner can't own a distribution company, or they can't be a supplier. And so that initially, the reason I bring that up is because that immediately makes our business very complicated and very difficult to work within. But the distribution piece of it, working with distributors, is what becomes very challenging because most states, not all, but most states have laws actually that prohibit you from selling your product directly to consumers or directly to retailers. You have to do it through a distributor. So you have to have a middleman. And dealing with those distributors or those middlemen can be challenging in that most of the distributors these days that you want to do business with have so much business and so many brands that they represent that it's very, very difficult to get share of mind until you actually start to generate some volume where it becomes worthwhile for them to be out actually pushing your product.
Very challenging indeed.
Yeah.
So Laurence, what would you say makes a great tequila in your opinion?
A great tequila for me is one that's really, truly full of really delicious flavor. And when I say flavor, I mean agave flavor. Agave roast, when you make tequila, you roast agave before you make tequila from it. And so the agave has this roasted quality to it. And so then you extract the sugars from that roasted agave, and those sugars then have this roasted quality to them. And so there's this flavor that can be imparted into tequila that a lot of people in the world aren't really that familiar with, because most people think of tequila as something that you shoot and you drink very quickly and you chase it with lime and salt, and so that you don't taste it. Because generally speaking, over the years, the larger tequila brands that are out there that make very high volume, low quality tequila, those are the tequilas you don't really want to taste because they don't taste very good. But what I look for is a really good flavor profile. So a tequila that has a lot of good flavors to it. I look for one that has what I call a lot of minerality. So a lot of feeling in your mouth, on your tongue, of different characteristics that come from minerality in the water that tequila is made from. So those are the two main things that I look for.
And what's your favorite way to drink tequila right now?
My favorite way to drink tequila almost always is sipping just straight tequila at room temperature. That's most of the time how I'm drinking it. But over the last 7 years since I've been at this, I've become a lot more passionate about cocktails and different ways of drinking spirits in general. And so when it comes to drinks, mixed drinks specifically, I absolutely love tequila Negroni and a tequila Manhattan.
And what's in a tequila Manhattan? Is that just like a regular Manhattan made with tequila?
Yeah, so you would just replace the whiskey for tequila. And in order to get the similarity, you'd want to use an aged tequila. You'd want to use an añejo tequila. That could be añejos can be anywhere from 1 to 3 years old, aged in barrels. And so I use our Suerte añejo, which is a 2-year product. And it's basically just equal parts tequila and sweet vermouth. And then you might throw a little, Angostura bitters and brandied cherry in there. And then you can stir it. You can stir it on ice and serve it up cold, or you can put it over the rocks, however you like, but it's phenomenal.
Now you're making me feel like it's almost happy hour right now. So
it is almost happy hour.
It's always happy hour for you. You're tequila brand. Laurence, we're coming to the near the end here, but what's so great about tequila?
What's so great about tequila is that agave as a plant species creates a sugar that can be fermented and distilled that makes a spirit like no other. And so other spirits, vodkas, whiskeys, bourbons, gins, other spirits are generally made from grains or potatoes or other plant species out there in the world. And they all create and produce their own outcome, their own sugar that's available for fermentation and distillation. The agave sugar is very different from every other sugar on the planet, in my opinion. And what's so great about tequila is that it's made from agave. That's really what's so great about tequila.
And so what's next for Suerte? Where are you going to go from here?
Where we're going to go with Suerte from here is we're going to continue to focus on the markets around the country that we're doing well, that we're getting some good brand awareness built in. And we're going to continue to grow the brand up over the next 3 to 5 years. We're building it ultimately for an exit. The goal with Suerte is to build it to a certain case volume and then have an acquisition happen for the brand.
Yeah. And where can our listeners find Suerte or find more about Suerte?
So everybody can learn more about Suerte at drinksuerte.com. You can also learn more about Suerte on social media channels. Instagram, we're at Suerte Tequila, all one word. Facebook, it's the same, at Suerte Tequila. And where people can find Suerte Tequilas, they can find it at their local liquor stores. If people have any restaurants around them that are still open and doing takeout and are doing mixed drinks as takeout drinks or even selling bottles, I encourage people to please continue to support restaurants as much as possible, so that when this current world situation ends, we have some restaurants left to enjoy. But the shops obviously is always a great place to get. Liquor stores is always a great place to find Suerte, and in Colorado, specifically in the Boulder, Denver area, but all around the state, we're very present in most liquor stores around.
Well, Laurence, thank you. And thank you to Suerte. We'll be looking forward to enjoying many a warm happy hour with Suerte Tequila, especially once we're all allowed to get back outside, but even before. Thank you very much for sharing your story.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thanks for having me.
And that is Laurence Spiewak and Suerte Tequila. I don't know about you, but it's margarita time here. Suerte Tequila, fresh lime juice, and a little agave. Shake with ice and pour. Well, that's the show. Until next time. Make sure to visit our website, www.wildstory.com, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode.
I like big stories and I cannot lie. You other storytellers can't deny.